The gunshot cracked through 125th Street like thunder ripping the sky in half. One shot, clean, final. For half a heartbeat, Harlem froze. Men who had lived their whole lives under the rhythm of sirens, shouting, and back-alley violence stood motionless, not because they had never heard gunfire before, but because they knew exactly what that shot meant. That wasn't panic fire. That wasn't chaos. That was a message, delivered with precision. And every man on that block understood who had sent it. Bumpy Johnson stood at the mouth of the alley, coat still open, breath steady, eyes calm in a way that unsettled everyone watching. The body on the pavement hadn't hit the ground yet before the weight of consequence settled over Harlem. This wasn't just a killing. This was a line crossed that could never be uncrossed. Because the man bleeding out at Bumpy's feet wasn't an enemy from the streets, he was family. The night air was thick with disbelief. A few steps away, someone whispered Bumpy's name, not as a question, but as a warning. When betrayal comes from within, the streets don't just react, they remember. And Harlem would remember this night forever. Years before that gunshot echoed, before betrayal carved itself into Harlem's spine, Ellsworth Bumpy Johnson had already become something larger than flesh and bone. He wasn't just a man who controlled territory, he controlled balance. In a world ruled by crooked cops, hungry politicians, and ruthless mobsters, Bumpy had mastered the art of standing upright in a city designed to keep him bent. Harlem in the 1930s and 40s wasn't just a neighborhood, it was a pressure cooker. Jazz spilled from basements, churches preached survival, numbers runners carried dreams in brown paper bags, and everywhere, white authority hovered like a constant shadow, extracting value while denying dignity. Bumpy Johnson learned early that respect wasn't given in Harlem. It was taken, then defended with intelligence, restraint, and when necessary, violence that spoke louder than any speech. He read books while other men sharpened knives. He quoted philosophers while planning moves that reshaped entire blocks. Italian mob bosses learned quickly that Harlem wasn't a playground. It was a negotiation table, and Bumpy sat at its head. He paid his people fairly. He protected his streets. He didn't tolerate chaos unless it served a purpose. And above all, he demanded loyalty. Because loyalty was the only currency more valuable than money. The man who would betray him understood that better than anyone. His name was Walter Green, Harlem-born, street-raised, Bumpy's right hand since the early days, when territory was measured in footsteps instead of blocks. Walter had eaten at Bumpy's table, had taken bullets meant for him, had carried messages when silence meant survival. He was trusted. That was his power. But by the late 1940s, pressure had started closing in from all sides. The Italian families wanted more control. Police captains wanted names. Federal men wanted headlines. And men like Walter, men who stood close enough to feel Bumpy's shadow, started asking themselves dangerous questions. What if loyalty was costing more than it paid? What if survival meant selling a piece of the legend? It started small. A missed delivery. A whispered name dropped in the wrong bar. Information passed carefully, anonymously, at first. Walter told himself it wasn't betrayal, just insurance. But insurance has a way of turning into contracts written in blood. Bumpy felt the shift before he saw it. He noticed how certain police raids hit too close to home, how rivals stepped out of ambushes they shouldn't have known about, how meetings suddenly felt crowded with invisible ears. Bumpy didn't accuse, he observed. Because legends don't move on instinct alone, they move on confirmation. He let the game play out longer than most men would have dared. Long enough for Walter to believe he was safe, long enough for the rope to unwind completely. The confirmation came on a cold night when a trusted courier never arrived. Instead, police did, moving with confidence that only comes from inside knowledge. Bumpy watched from a distance as one of his own was dragged into the street, beaten, and hauled away. That was the moment the truth settled. There was a traitor at his table, and Bumpy Johnson never forgave betrayal. The meeting was called for midnight. Neutral ground, An abandoned pool hall on Lenox Avenue, lights dim, chairs arranged with deliberate symmetry. Men arrived quiet, eyes sharp, hands steady. No one joked, no one lingered. Walter walked in last. He smiled when he saw Bumpy, the way he always had. Familiar, comfortable, deadly. Bumpy returned the look with calm politeness, the kind that made men uneasy without knowing why. They talked business first, numbers, routes, territory. Every word measured, every pause heavy. Then Bumpy stood. The room went silent. He didn't raise his voice, didn't accuse. He simply asked one question, soft, surgical, impossible to escape. Who told the police about the 126th Street drop? No one answered. Walter swallowed, and in that silence, Harlem held its breath. Because everyone in that room knew what came next would decide more than one man's fate. It would decide the rules of loyalty in Harlem for years to come. No one spoke. The silence inside the abandoned pool hall stretched long enough to become its own accusation. Dust hung in the air, illuminated by a single bare bulb that hummed softly overhead. The men seated around the table understood the rules of moments like this. Whoever spoke first either survived or confessed. Bumpy Johnson stood at the head of the table, hands resting lightly on the worn wood, eyes moving slowly from face to face. He wasn't searching for guilt. He already had that. He was measuring fear. Some men stared at the table, others stared at the wall. A few tried to meet his eyes and failed. Walter Green forced a laugh. "Bumpy," he said, spreading his hands, voice easy, practiced. "You know how it is. Cops get lucky sometimes." Bumpy turned to him, unhurried. "Luck don't knock down the right door at the right time," he replied. "Luck don't know which man's holding what." Walter's smile tightened. "You saying someone talked?" "I'm saying the police walked like they had a map." The bulb flickered. Bumpy leaned back into his chair, finally sitting, crossing one leg over the other. The posture was relaxed, but the room understood the danger of it. This was the calm before consequence. "Everybody in here," Bumpy continued, "has bled for Harlem. I won't disrespect that, but understand something clear. When one man sells the rest, he don't just choose his own fate. He chooses the fate of everybody tied to him." Walter shifted in his seat. Just slightly. Enough. After the meeting broke, Bumpy didn't order violence. He didn't issue threats. That restraint unsettled men more than any outburst could have. Harlem knew his pattern. Bumpy only moved when every angle was accounted for. And while the streets whispered, Bumpy watched. He watched Walter's routines change. Watched him start using payphones on unfamiliar blocks. Watched him arrive late, leave early. Watched him carry himself like a man already halfway gone. What Walter didn't know was that betrayal leaves fingerprints even when hands are clean. A runner Bumpy trusted followed him one night. 2 blocks, 3. Then watched Walter step into a bar that didn't serve locals, only cops who drank in plain clothes and men desperate enough to talk to them. The runner didn't need to hear the conversation. Seeing Walter walk out alone, pale and tight-lipped, was confirmation enough. The price of betrayal became clear 2 days later when one of Bumpy's safe houses was raided, emptied down to the floorboards. No arrests, no charges, just a message. We know everything. That kind of knowledge didn't come cheap. Bumpy finally moved. He didn't confront Walter right away. Instead, he cut him off quietly. Routes reassigned. Information restricted. Walter noticed, but misread it. He thought Bumpy was retreating. He thought the legend was tired. That miscalculation sealed his fate. Because Bumpy Johnson never acted out of panic. He acted out of finality. The night Harlem froze began with a lie. Walter was told there'd been a problem with a shipment, nothing unusual. He was asked to check it personally. Old trust invoked. Familiar duty. The location was an alley off 125th Street, a place so ordinary it felt safe. He walked in confident. Bumpy was already there, alone. Walter slowed when he saw him. "You ain't bring nobody?" he asked, trying to keep his voice light. Bumpy smiled faintly. "Didn't need to. The city hummed around them. Somewhere nearby, a train rattled. A radio played low jazz through an open window. For a moment, neither man spoke. Then Bumpy said quietly, "How much?" Walter frowned. "How much what?" "You sold me," Bumpy replied. "So I'm asking, how much?" Walter's eyes darted once, then steadied. "You don't know what you're talking about." Bumpy nodded, as if he'd expected that answer. He reached into his coat slowly, deliberately. Walter's hand twitched. Bumpy pulled out folded papers and dropped them on a crate between them. Police notes, schedules, names, routes. Everything only an insider could know. Walter's breath caught. "They paid you $50,000, Bumpy continued. "Promised protection. Promised you'd be fine once I was gone." Walter's shoulders sagged just enough to confirm it. "You don't understand," Walter said, voice cracking now. "They were coming anyway. I was just trying to survive." Bumpy stepped closer. "Survival without honor is just a slower death," he said. Walter's eyes filled, not with remorse, but fear. "You don't have to do this," he whispered. "We were brothers." Bumpy looked at him for a long moment. "Brothers don't sell brothers." The gunshot echoed down 125th Street like judgment. The sound carried farther than the bullet. People stepped out of doorways, windows cracked open. Somewhere a woman screamed. Somewhere else a man crossed himself. Bumpy stood over the body, breathing steady, face unreadable. He tucked the gun away and straightened his coat. He didn't run. He didn't hide. He walked out of the alley and into legend, because Harlem understood what had just happened. A line had been drawn in blood, and every man who thought about betraying the streets from that night forward would remember the sound of that single shot. By morning, Harlem already knew, not from newspapers, not from police statements, from silence, from the way certain corners went still, from the way men spoke softer and walked straighter, from the way nobody asked questions they didn't want answered. Walter Green's body was found just after dawn. Police cordoned off the alley with cheap rope and louder than necessary voices, but the scene told its own story. No struggle, no panic, one shot, clean and deliberate. The kind of execution that didn't belong to amateurs or hotheads. This wasn't street violence. This was discipline. A detective crouched near the body, eyes narrowing as he studied the angle of the wound. He didn't need a report to know what this was. He stood and looked down the block toward Lenox Avenue, toward Harlem proper. "Bumpy," he muttered. No warrant was issued that day, no raid ordered, because law enforcement understood something they rarely admitted aloud. When Bumpy Johnson acted openly, it was because he had already balanced the scales. The police could make noise, but they couldn't make it stick. Inside Harlem, the reaction was immediate and unified. Men who had been wavering tightened their circles. Runners stopped taking unnecessary risks. Middlemen relearned the value of silence. Loyalty, once taken for granted, was suddenly sacred again, because betrayal now had a face and an ending. Old women on stoops shook their heads, not in approval, but in understanding. Mothers pulled their sons closer and whispered warnings that carried the weight of scripture. "Mind your business," they said, "and mind your loyalties." This wasn't fear. This was order being restored. Bumpy Johnson didn't celebrate. He didn't hold court. He returned to routine as if nothing extraordinary had occurred. That restraint elevated the act beyond revenge. It turned it into justice. A message delivered once doesn't need repeating. The Italian families heard quickly. In back rooms downtown, men in tailored suits discussed the implications with careful language. Walter Green had been valuable, not for who he was, but for what he knew. His death meant two things. The information pipeline had been cut, and Bumpy Johnson had reminded everyone exactly how he handled betrayal. One capo shook his head slowly. "He didn't hide it," he said. "That's the dangerous part." Another nodded. "Means he's not scared of war." They agreed on one thing. Harlem would not be pressured right now, not after that. Law enforcement tried anyway. 2 days after the shooting, Bumpy was brought in for questioning. No cuffs, no spectacle, just procedure. He sat across from a captain who had spent his career underestimating men like him. "Where were you Tuesday night?" the captain asked. Bumpy met his eyes calmly. "Home. Reading." The captain scoffed. "You expect me to believe that?" Bumpy leaned forward slightly. "You expect me to believe you don't already know you can't prove otherwise?" The room went quiet. The captain studied him, then leaned back. "One day, Johnson," he said, "you'll make a mistake." Bumpy smiled thinly. "Everybody does. Question is, who's still standing when it happens?" No charges were filed. Bumpy walked out free. Harlem noticed. The real consequence came not through violence but through correction. Men who had once flirted with informants suddenly found doors closed. No threats were issued, no explanations given. They were simply excluded. Business moved around them. Trust evaporated. That kind of punishment lingered longer than bullets. Bumpy understood something fundamental about power. It wasn't about how many men you could hurt. It was about how many you could make remember. Months passed. The streets stabilized. Profits returned. Violence dropped. Even police raids became more predictable, more cautious. Order had reasserted itself. Walter Green's name faded from conversation, mentioned only as a warning, never as a martyr. Because nobody in Harlem confused betrayal with bravery. Years later, old-timers would talk about that night not with excitement, but with reverence. They'd say, that was when Harlem learned the difference between chaos and consequence. They'd say, that was when Bumpy showed he wasn't just running numbers, he was running principles. And they'd say it quietly, because legends don't need loud voices to be heard. Time did what it always does in Harlem. It moved forward, but it never forgot. The night Walter Green died didn't fade into rumor or exaggeration. It hardened into history. Men who hadn't even been active on the streets when it happened spoke about it with certainty, as if they'd been standing right there in the alley. That was how deeply the lesson traveled. Because Bumpy Johnson hadn't just punished betrayal, he had defined its price. In the years that followed, Harlem operated differently. Meetings became quieter, smaller. Information moved through fewer hands. Trust, once casually given, now had weight and consequence attached to it. That shift wasn't imposed by fear alone, it was imposed by clarity. Everyone knew the rules now, and rules, when enforced consistently, create stability. Bumpy's reputation changed after that night. Before, he was known as brilliant, educated, dangerous when crossed. After, he became something more precise, final. A man who didn't threaten, a man who didn't bluff, a man who acted once and never needed to repeat himself. Italian bosses adjusted their tone when his name came up. Police captains stopped using diminutives and started using surnames. Politicians who once spoke about Harlem as a problem began speaking about it as a negotiation. That shift didn't happen because of money. It happened because of respect. There was a moment, years later, when a younger operator asked one of Bumpy's lieutenants why Walter Green's story was still told so carefully. "He was one of us," the man replied. "That's why." That was the legacy. Bumpy didn't kill an outsider to make a point. He punished betrayal from within. That distinction mattered. It told the world that loyalty in Harlem wasn't symbolic. It was binding. Even law enforcement learned restraint. Files were opened and quietly closed. Witnesses reconsidered cooperation. Informants demanded guarantees nobody could realistically provide. The cost of entering Bumpy's circle, on either side of the law, became too high. A veteran detective once admitted, off the record, "You could plan around Bumpy. You could negotiate with him, but you couldn't corner him. Men like that don't panic. They conclude." That conclusion was Harlem's shield. Bumpy himself never spoke publicly about Walter Green. He didn't justify it, didn't mythologize it. When asked years later by a reporter how he maintained loyalty, he answered simply, People follow rules they believe will be enforced. Nothing more, nothing less. The younger generation learned differently than the last, not through chaos or bravado, but through example. They saw that power wasn't loud, it was consistent. They saw that dignity mattered, even in criminal spaces. And they understood that betrayal didn't make you clever, it made you temporary. Bumpy Johnson became, in that understanding, less a gangster and more a governor of his own domain. A man who enforced justice the streets recognized, even when the law pretended not to. By the time his name became cemented in books, documentaries, and whispered legends, that night on 125th Street had taken on a different meaning. It wasn't remembered as violence. It was remembered as correction, as balance restored, as Harlem standing still for one heartbeat, then moving forward with rules written in blood, but upheld by discipline. History often remembers men like Bumpy Johnson through numbers, indictments, and headlines. But Harlem remembered him differently. Harlem remembered the pause. That single moment after the gunshot, when the city stopped breathing, not out of fear, but recognition. Recognition that a boundary had been crossed and corrected. Recognition that loyalty still meant something in a world designed to strip it away. Recognition that power, when exercised with restraint, becomes authority. This wasn't just about one betrayal or one life ended in a dark alley. It was about order. It was about a community learning, again, that dignity doesn't survive on good intentions alone. It survives because someone is willing to enforce its limits. And sometimes, that someone isn't wearing a badge or holding a gavel. Sometimes, it's a man who understands the streets better than the law ever could. Bumpy Johnson didn't celebrate that night. He didn't boast. He didn't rewrite the story to make himself look righteous. He let Harlem do what Harlem had always done best. Remember. Remember the rules. Remember the cost. Remember the silence after consequence. Because legends aren't built on how loud a man speaks. They're built on what happens when he finally acts. And on the night Harlem froze, the city learned a truth that echoed for generations. Respect isn't demanded. It's enforced. And once enforced, it doesn't need repeating. This wasn't just the story of Bumpy Johnson. This was the story of a community drawing its line and trusting one man to defend it. That's why his name still carries weight. That's why his legend still stands. And that's why, long after the sirens faded and the streets moved on, Harlem never forgot the night it stood still and chose order over chaos.